Imagine waking up one morning to find that the currency sitting in your central bank reserves, the one your entire national economy has been denominated in for decades, is no longer accepted by your most important trading partners. That is not a hypothetical scenario. It is already happening. Right now, Iran is systematically dismantling its reliance on the US dollar in international trade. Oil deals, once priced exclusively in dollars, are now being settled in Chinese Yuan. Bilateral agreements are being quietly rewritten. The financial infrastructure that underpinned global oil markets for half a century is showing visible cracks. And the financial press, most of it is treating this as a geopolitical story, a chess move between Washington and Tehran, a sanction workaround, a Cold War echo. But that framing misses almost everything that matters, because what is actually happening in Tehran's treasury rooms, in Beijing's financial ministries, and in the boardrooms of the oil trading companies caught in the middle is not primarily a story about politics. It is a story about human psychology. It is a story about what happens when governments, institutions, and entire economies are gripped by the same irrational forces that cause a poker player to go all in on a losing hand. Not because the odds have changed, but because walking away feels worse than losing everything. The framework that explains this most precisely is not found in geopolitical analysis. It is found in the behavioral economics of Nobel laureate Richard H. Thaler. And what it reveals about Iran's yuan play will completely reframe how you see this story. Richard H. Thaler is the University of Chicago economist who won the 2017 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his foundational work in behavioral economics. His life's research is built on one core insight: human beings and the institutions they create do not behave like the rational actors that classical economics assumes. They are predictably irrational. And when the stakes are existential, as they are for Iran's economic survival, that irrationality does not diminish. It intensifies. To understand why Iran's move toward the yuan is more psychologically driven than economically rational, start with Thaler's most foundational concept, loss aversion. In Thaler's landmark research, conducted alongside Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, the data consistently showed that the psychological pain of a loss is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Human beings, in other words, are not wired to make symmetric decisions. They will take irrational risks to avoid losses that they would never take simply to pursue gains. Now apply this to Iran's position. The Iranian economy has been hemorrhaging under successive waves of US sanctions since 1979, with the most severe rounds coming in 2012 and 2018. The country has watched its oil revenues collapse, its currency lose catastrophic value, and its ability to participate in global financial systems get systematically dismantled. In Thaler's framework, Iran is not making a cool-headed strategic pivot toward the yuan. It is making a loss aversion-driven flight away from a system it perceives, correctly or not, as a permanent source of pain. The distinction is critical. A rational actor moves toward the best option. A loss-averse actor moves away from the worst perceived threat. The destination is sometimes the same, but the decision-making process and the commitment to that decision is fundamentally different. Next, consider Thaler's concept of the status quo bias. In his research on default choices and behavioral nudges, Thaler demonstrated that people and institutions display a powerful, often irrational preference for their current state. Change, even clearly beneficial change, is resisted because of the psychological discomfort of transitioning. Now, here is the paradox. Iran is violating its own status quo bias by abandoning the dollar. Why? Because Thaler's work also shows that status quo bias collapses under conditions of perceived threat. When the existing arrangement is associated with ongoing loss and punishment, the psychological calculus flips. Staying becomes the threat. Moving becomes the perceived safety. This is precisely the behavioral trap that U.S. sanctions policy has inadvertently created, and it has made the dollar-denominated status quo so painful for Iran that the normal human preference for inertia has been overridden. A third framework to apply here is mental accounting, Thaler's theory that people and institutions do not treat money as perfectly fungible. They sort value into separate psychological buckets. Iran has mentally recategorized the US dollar not as neutral currency, but as a weaponized instrument of coercion. Once that recategorization occurs, once the dollar is mentally filed under threat rather than tool, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse, not because the economic calculus demands it, but because the psychological ledger has already been closed. China's yuan, by contrast, has been mentally filed under relief. It is not that the yuan is objectively superior, it is that it carries none of the psychological weight of accumulated loss. Here is where mainstream analysis consistently falls short, and where Thaler's behavioral lens reveals something the geopolitical commentators are missing. Most analysts frame Iran's yuan shift as a workaround, a clever but ultimately limited maneuver by a sanctioned state trying to keep its oil money flowing. The implicit assumption is that this is contained, a bilateral arrangement between two outlier economies that poses no systemic risk to the broader dollar-dominated financial order. Thaler's research on herding behavior and social proof suggests that assumption is dangerously wrong in his work on behavioral nudges and market dynamics. Thaler documented how individual decisions, especially those made under conditions of uncertainty, are powerfully influenced by the observable choices of others. When one actor is seen to successfully abandon a system that others have privately questioned, it functions as a psychological permission slip. It makes the unthinkable thinkable. Iran is not alone in its grievances with dollar-denominated trade. Russia accelerated its own de-dollarization following 2022 sanctions. Saudi Arabia has publicly discussed yuan-denominated oil contracts. Brazil and Argentina have explored bilateral trade in local currencies. Each of these conversations was happening quietly, privately, held back partly by the psychological weight of the status quo. What Iran's visible, functioning yuan trade does is provide social proof. It demonstrates that the exit is real, that it works, that the cost of leaving is survivable. And this is the unseen consequence that behavioral economics predicts with clarity. Once enough actors observe that the transition is possible and survivable, the psychological barrier to doing the same drops dramatically. Not because the economics suddenly changed, but because the fear of being first has been eliminated. There is a second unseen consequence that Thaler's endowment effect illuminates. Once Iran has fully restructured its trade infrastructure, its contracts, its financial relationships around the yuan, it will value that new system far more highly than any objective assessment would justify, simply because it owns it. The endowment effect will lock this transition in place long after the original drivers have faded. If Thaler's models hold, and the behavioral data accumulated over 4 decades suggests they do, here is what to watch for. First, watch for a slow motion cascade among secondary oil exporting nations. Not dramatic announcements, not public declarations, but quiet incremental additions of yuan settlement options alongside the dollar. Behavioral signature of herding behavior is that it rarely looks dramatic in the early stages. It looks like small, defensible, individually rational decisions until suddenly the aggregate shift is impossible to ignore. Second, watch for U.S. policy responses that inadvertently accelerate the very behavior they are designed to prevent. Thaler's research on reactants, the psychological backlash against perceived coercion, predicts that aggressive sanctions responses to yuan adoption will intensify, not reduce. The psychological motivation to de-dollarize among nations that feel similarly exposed. Third, and most importantly, watch the yuan's trajectory not as a currency story, but as a trust story. The dollar's reserve status was never purely about economics. It was about psychological confidence, institutional inertia, and the absence of a credible alternative. Thaler's work suggests that once those psychological foundations begin to crack, the speed of the shift can surprise even the most prepared analysts. Here is the reframe that Thaler's behavioral economics leaves us with. Iran's yuan play is not primarily about Iran. It is not primarily about the yuan, and it is not primarily about oil. It is about the moment when accumulated psychological pain overrides institutional inertia and what happens next when others are watching. The dollar's dominance was built on trust, habit, and the absence of a felt alternative. Thaler's work shows that all three can erode faster than rational models predict. So here is the question, folks. Do comments, do you think the behavioral shift away from the dollar has already passed the point of no return, or is this still reversible? Drop your view below. If this analysis changed how you see the story, like this video, subscribe to Flashpoint and hit the notification bell, because the next episode goes even deeper.